Thank you, Rochelle. Good evening. I am the associate pastor here, Reverend Valerie Austin. It is nice to meet you if I have not met you before, and it's good to have us all together tonight in honor of Black History Month. Dr. Angela Sims is the first female president of Colgate-Rochester Crozer Divinity School and the first president to lead CRCDS at its new location on North Goodman Street in Rochester, New York, where it just moved last summer. She earned her PhD at Union Presbyterian Seminary in Christian Social Ethics in 2008. Her dissertation was entitled Just Act, Ida B. Wells and Ethical Complications of Lynching. Dr. Sims is the author and co-author of several books and articles and is the recipient of an array of grants and fellowships. Dr. Sims came to CRCDS from St. Paul School of Theology in Kansas and Oklahoma, which happens to be where I earned my Master of Divinity, and had the opportunity to take several courses from Dr. Sims. She served as the Vice President of Institutional Advancement, the Robert B. and Kathleen Rogers Professor in Church and Society, and as the Professor of Ethics and Black Church Studies. In the classes I have taken from Dr. Sims, I have found her to be a professor that not only cultivates atmospheres of deep, serious theological reflection, but engages students in examining and grappling with issues of power, privilege, injustice, and inequality. I personally have been inspired to grow and to act by Dr. Sims' unapologetic pursuit of justice for marginalized communities, as I have experienced her voice to be both prophetic and bold, and I am excited to hear what she brings to us this evening. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Angela Sims.
Pastor Greg, and to the people of Mountain Rise United Church of Christ, it is always good to be able to see and to experience the communities that welcome one's students. So thank you for the way in which you have not only welcomed Reverend Austin, but provided a space and place for her to live into her own potential. You have yet to see what you shall be. And so to each of you, thank you. And for those of you who are friends of Mountain Rise, thank you for coming out on this chilly evening. I often like to sort of take the temperature of a place when I'm invited to speak. And I took the temperature of this space tonight by looking at a message that hangs in the North X. And that message says, be the church. Protect the environment, care for the poor, forgive often, reject racism, fight for the powerless, share earthly and spiritual resources, embrace diversity, love God, and in all of that, enjoy this life. I'm told that this is also a time during the year where you also think about the life of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And that timing was such that this year's remembrance coincides with an annual monthly recognition by many to acknowledge the contributions of persons of African descent to various sectors of this country's collective life. And so I'm going to draw your attention not to a memory of birth, but to the April 4, 1968 assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. When we consider our personal and communal theologies of life, more than a half century on this side of Dr. King's murder, evidence of an insurgence of white nationalism serves as a timely reminder that then and now, the 1960s and the second decade of the 21st century, is a timely reminder that Black lives, Jewish lives, Muslim lives, the lives of non-practitioners of white supremacist religion, trans lives, the lives of persons who question inhumane practices, the separation of families at specific points of entry, the caging of children, travel bans, deportation of DACA recipients, that more than 50 years since Dr. King was assassinated, evidence of an insurgence of white nationalism serves as a daily reminder that then and now, too many lives in these disunited states of America are seen by one too many as insignificant. We need only to reflect, however, for a brief moment on what I describe as the creating of an icon that is often void of a thick historical recounting of the manner in which King's very embodiment as a black man was a site for expressions of racially sanctioned hatred, authorized and endorsed by supposedly law-abiding citizens. Consider, if you will, the decision of J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who in 1963, and I quote, upon receiving intelligence that someone was trying to kill King, refused to warn King as the Bureau routinely warned other potential targets. The FBI assigned full enemy status to King, who had staked his life and his religion on the chance that enemy thinking might be overcome, close quote. Taylor Branch, an official biographer of Dr. King and author of Parting the Waters, America in the King Years, 1954 to 1963, challenges us to think now about the implications associated with the knowledge, and I quote, that an intelligence agency took such a step in the belief that King was an enemy of freedom, ignorant of the reality that King had just set in motion the greatest firestorm of domestic liberty in 100 years, was one of the saddest ironies of American history, close quote. King was, as civil rights activist A. Philip Randolph, who in 1925 founded the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the first predominantly black labor union in this country, said, and I quote, that King was the moral leader of our nation, close quote. For King, and I quote, law is the mortar of society, but the primordial source of law is justice. When the conflict between them is irreconcilable, one must strike for justice, despite the terrifying potential for anarchy in such an action, close quote. Then and now, to remember King is to acknowledge that law and justice are not necessarily synonymous. To remember King is to acknowledge historical truths that are often cloaked in rhetoric of denial with calls to move on, with calls to suggest that was then, and yet, how do we remember King if we do not, for instance, acknowledge ways in which participation in non-violent civil disobedience was met by a series of violent attacks that included, in Birmingham alone, as an example of racialized hatred, the bombing of the home of King's brother, Alfred Daniel King, and the bombing of Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church that killed 4 girls and 2 boys and that injured 14. Then and now, a rallying concern for many non-cisgendered heterosexual white men, or those who can choose to pass as such, is a reluctance by one too many residents of this country to grapple with the social analysis that informed Dr. King's dream for a beloved community. All too often, the focus is on King's oratorical style at the expense of analyzing the import of his message and its contemporary relevance. Born out of a deep sense of hope in the midst of a reign of terror, and I understand that some of you are reading James Cone's memoir, and most of you know that James Cone, the progenitor of Black theology, was also very much shaped by his experience of terror growing up in rural Arkansas. And so what King offers humanity is an antidote to nihilism. It is a hope shaped in the shadow of lynching trees and other symbols used to incite fear and intimidation. From trees on courthouse lawns to high-pressured water hoses, to police clubs, to dogs. 51 years on this side of King's assassination, it is imperative that we realize that his social, historical, economic insights are antithetical to a rising oligarchy that seeks to disrupt notions of freedom and human decency. To remember King is an invitation now to engage in intersexual contextual analyses that take seriously the role of symbols in a culture predicated and sustained on violence. The youngest and the third person of African descent to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, King dared to dream that the United States of America's Bank of Justice is solvent. King dealt with the reality of inequality in a nation that marketed itself in 1964 as the land of the free and the home of the brave. A land in 1964 where black people, where poor people of all ethnicities, and where most women were denied basic liberties and were rarely beneficiaries of often undisclosed legacy policies that granted access to a select few while exacerbating disparities in education, employment, and housing. King's words continue to serve as a call to conscience. His Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech described vividly the conditions of government-sanctioned violence that black persons and persons who stood in solidarity with blacks were subjected when they exercised their First Amendment right of speech and collective protests. King, recounting why he and countless others in the United States of America were engaged in a creative battle to end the long night of racial injustice, provided these details. In Birmingham, Alabama, King said, "Our children, crying out for brotherhood and for sisterhood, were answered with fire hoses, snarling dogs, and even death." He said that more than 40 houses of worship in the state of Mississippi alone were bombed or burned because they offered a sanctuary to those who would not accept segregation. He also pointed out that in Philadelphia, Mississippi, young people seeking to secure the right to vote were brutalized and murdered. Now as then, in 2020, one too many children are subjected to racial profiling, and too few parents and concerned adults understand fully the school-to-prison pipeline. In 2020, jurisdictions that adopt sanctuary policies do so aware of cost associated when one challenges the injustice of an unjust law. And across the United States, voter suppression is in full force in the 21st century, with names being purged from records, while incarcerated and formerly incarcerated persons contend with issues of permanent disenfranchisement, and while one too many people promote the lie that some people's votes don't matter. It's important to understand that without a doubt, all votes matter, and persons who expend money and energy to spend a different narrative know how important each voice and vote are. Or as King stated in his Give Us the Ballot speech, and I quote, "All types of conniving methods are still being used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters. The denial of this sacred right is a tragic betrayal of the highest mandates of our democratic tradition. And so our most urgent request to the President of the United States and every member of Congress is to give us the right to vote." Close quote. When King accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, the United States was also into its 8th year of what would become an almost 20-year military engagement in Vietnam. Then and now, questions about continued U.S. military presence in the Middle East and recent resolutions and ongoing discussions about presidential war powers also remind me of the significance of King's prophetic insights as a basis from which to develop responses to current social issues. Even now, we cannot ignore King's description of the stark reality of 1964 that mirrors, unfortunately, these initial weeks of 2020. As King stated, and I quote, "Debilitating and grinding poverty afflicts my people and chains them to the lowest rungs of the economic ladder," close quote. This insight is a clarion reminder to avoid romanticizing exceptionalism and to acknowledge that while some citizens are taxed enough already, a small percentage of persons who are perhaps not taxed enough, with added benefits from tax loopholes, suggests that a tendency to focus on an imagined middle class and an elite minority further obscures the plight of persons who are impoverished and should prompt each of us to review our working definitions of equity and justice. Then and now, governmental programs implemented to address poverty are typically not designed to dismantle systems from which a select few benefit financially, nor to counter the pull yourself up by your bootstraps myth. Programmatic mismanagement exacerbates a tendency to shift blame to the very people who are often ill-equipped to navigate bureaucratic systems that objectify and commodify humans. In spite of needed improvements that lend themselves to valuing the human dignity of all persons, government initiatives in the form of social safety nets can be a positive response to address life-negating conditions of the least of these in a country that continues to self-market itself as the wealthiest nation in the world. I would suggest that if billions of dollars can be spent on political campaign ads, surely government agencies can partner with community and faith-based organizations to guarantee access to affordable housing and provide quality preventive medical care to all residents, to dispel disparities in public education, and to ensure that no community is a food desert. At the same time, adult recipients of TANF and SNAP, formerly known as welfare and food stamps, for example, are frequently characterized as lazy and increasingly dependent on the federal government for handouts, while children, about 21% of whom live in families with incomes below the federal poverty threshold, are often invisible and thus ignored. Then and now, this level of blind indifference suggests a literal understanding by some persons who self-identify as Christian of a biblical injunction ascribed to Jesus that you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me. This non-nuanced, acontextual interpretation refuses to consider an alternative biblical account that is coupled with a mandate that we can show kindness to them whenever we wish. When we consider the plight of persons in a republic that markets itself as a democracy built on and sustained by an oligarchic, capitalistic enterprise, how we treat persons who are impoverished is often in stark contrast to entitlements bestowed upon this country's wealthiest citizens. How we treat people who are economically and otherwise disadvantaged matters. For as King so aptly articulated, and I quote, "Poverty is one of the most urgent items on the agenda of modern life," close quote. However, if, as King insisted, and I quote, "oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever," close quote, we cannot ignore that the demand for dignity, equality, jobs, and citizenship will not be abandoned or diluted or postponed. King issues a moral call to action that requires us to consider how we appropriate our various points of privilege to confront systemic sins couched in xenophobic rhetoric. Then and now, a commitment to equity and justice demands that we not ignore vitriol-infused language to invoke fear of the other. Will we, as King so boldly proclaimed in 1964, not flinch, not be cowed, not be afraid to stand on the side of justice? Renewed calls to understand and apply constitutional rights compel me to consider how the plight of persons ensnared, for example, in global human trafficking networks influence my own ability to grasp these and other documented truths. Allow me to suggest that our response to the facts that are ever before us, that are sustained by capitalistic enterprise, are indicators of our own moral compass. Resolute in his commitment to confront evil with a theologically informed human rights agenda, King was adamant that there is nothing new about poverty, there is nothing new about injustice. With the audacity to imagine a beloved community, King's sense of audacious faith would not allow him to accept despair as the final response to the ambiguities of history. Then and now, audacious faith requires a type of sight that can imagine things as they should be and not as they are, so that women, for example, will not be subjected to draconian attempts to subvert reproductive rights. As King made clear, audacious faith rejects the idea, and I quote, that the view that humankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood and sisterhood can never become a reality. With unrestrained imagination, audacious faith beckons us to name unambiguously evil cloaked in political rhetoric. And audacious faith demands an accurate interpretation of calls to make America great again, so that we do not unconsciously succumb to dehumanizing practices. Then and now, when we consider an anti-intellectual sentiment present in too many sectors of society, audacious faith demands that we remember that approximately 150 years ago, it was illegal for persons of African descent to read and write in this country. By contrast, King had the audacity to believe peoples everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education and culture for their minds, and dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits. I am convinced that audacious faith must draw attention to de facto segregation that results in a rampant form of educational genocide that leaves more than one child too ill prepared to engage in public life or to contribute to the common good. At the same time, audacious faith demands that we not envision higher education as an elite privilege, but rather as an avenue by which many are granted access to dream a world where their ideas are essential to influencing decisions that affect the well-being of the world's population. Then and now, audacious faith reminds us, as King remarked, and I quote, that in the final analysis, the rich must not ignore the poor, because both rich and poor are tied in a single garment of destiny, close quote. With lying perceived by many as a virtue, we find ourselves at a point where careful attention must be given to the manner in which moral issues are depicted in the media. Now as then, informed by the lived reality of persons whose humanity is subjected to gross disregard, audacious faith invites us to cultivate a hope that even if God does not respond as we desire, that we will continue to persist in our efforts, ever mindful that God is yet with us. In this moment, King encourages us to keep faith in the future, to not despair. For the work to which we are called, the work of justice, is not work for those who are faint of heart. Thank you. You want me to take questions?